right, this is chapter 2, video number 4. And let me caveat by saying we do not go into great detail in energy metabolism. If you were taking a biochemistry class, you could spend a month doing this. The citric acid cycle, the glycolysis, fancy terms. You could spend a month getting into this. It's not the scope of this class. What do you use for energy, mostly? Carbohydrates, protein, and fat. A couple things you don't realize. You eat starchy foods like bread or pasta or whatever, but you got to digest those into individual sugar molecules. We'll cover this when we get to the sugar chapter or the carbohydrate chapter, but we are burning single molecules, like a single Lego of carbohydrate, not strands of them, single ones. The primary carbohydrate in the body for fuel is glucose. Many things are made from glucose. You can eat sugars that look like glucose, like fructose, which is very sweet. But even if you eat fructose-containing foods, like high fructose corn syrup or fruit, we end up converting that fructose to glucose, and so we end up burning glucose. Can you burn protein for fuel? You do. You probably burn, and I don't know the number here exactly, but the standard nutrition text was 5 to 10% of your calories per day comes from dietary protein. Because first off, you can't build and repair with all the protein that you have. So some of it is just extra protein, just more than you need, and there's no place to secretly store dietary protein, so we just end up using it for fuel. And then fat is the last one. You do not burn fat that you eat. Fat that you eat is shipped via a very complex process, which we'll talk about in the fat chapter. When you exercise, you're burning body fat. That's why for exercise and activity, there is zero advantage of eating fat. Whatever you think you've heard, there's no advantage from eating fat. I know there are some types of fat called medium chain triglycerides that may have some advantage, but for the average athlete, just eating fat before an event is just trouble because you can't even burn it. It uses too many resources. We burn body fat. That's the key. Okay, that's a silly slide. So what do we actually make when we make energy? Think of it this way. All the macronutrients that we eat, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, are complex molecules. Something else put a lot of energy from the earth into those molecules. Sticking carbons together and oxygen to a carbon and hydrogen to oxygens and hydrogen to carbons, a lot of energy was involved. And when you rip those molecules apart, you release energy. And what do we use to rip them apart? Water and oxygen, right? Or I should say, oxygen. So when we rip apart those molecules, we recombine those atoms with oxygen into CO2, carbon dioxide, and water. That's our waste product. So you're going to rip up all these molecules. And you're going to take little micro bits of energy from each atomic bond, but you want to stick them somewhere, like a credit card or a debit card or a currency for using around the body. And if you don't know this yet, humans use every living thing on Earth, I should say, uses a common currency called ATP. It's a molecule that has these 3 phosphate groups. You don't need to know what that means, but it has these 3 little chemical groups called phosphate, and you can pull one of the phosphates off and release energy, and then you can stick one back on and store energy. So ATP is like a one-use debit card, except cells make millions of ATP molecules every second. Cells are disassembling the macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and protein, making ATP, and then spending those ATPs to wave your hands, blink, pump your heart, make something, make hair, not me, someone else. You spend the ATP to do stuff, and you get the energy to make ATP from the foods that we eat, basically, in a nutshell. Okay, now, what are the 3 ways that we can make ATP? Well, we can make it very relaxed. We call that aerobically, using body fat and stored glucose in the body sugar. How long does that last for? You can probably do that for about 2 hours because that's how long glucose lasts for, right? That's aerobic. When you're doing things extremely active, not ninja shot put sprinting, but pretty high intensity, we call those anaerobic. A little slide that'll have the name in a second. And those are interesting because you're not actually burning anything when you're anaerobic. You're converting. And I'll explain that. And then you get the third one. It's called the creatine phosphate or the phosphogene system. And what the phosphogene system really is has nothing to do with macronutrients. It's you want to throw a heavy ball really far, and all that ATP sitting in all your muscles involved for throwing that little ball really far will be used immediately. You will spend all your debit cards immediately. How do you then throw another little ball really far? You have a backup debit card. Cells keep a backup debit card molecule called creatine phosphate. And you can break the creatine phosphate in half and almost, for all practical purposes, immediately regenerate your ATP. The problem with the creatine process is muscles have about 10 seconds worth of backup debit card molecules, this creatine. So it works really good for like a 100-meter dash, which by the way is about 10 seconds. And it works really good for lifting weights and shot putting, but you really can't use it for these other ones. So it's funny, different kind of sports last different lengths, and they all use different kinds of systems, right? You can walk for hours aerobically, we'd say aerobically, using oxygen, burning fat and glucose. You can speed skate for about a minute and a half, and you're not burning anything, you're converting. Again, I'll explain that. Or you can do shot put and like sprint for about 10 seconds. And that's the way the body kind of makes ATP, regenerates ATP or whatever. Okay, so here's a way to sum it up. The creatine phosphate system is the phosphogene system. It's used for rapidly regenerating ATP. You don't have that much of it. By the way, those of you who lift weights, if you sum up all the amount of time of actually doing curls, is it really more than 10 seconds, right? And it can take 24 hours to regenerate creatine. You would never want to lift on your biceps lifters 2 days in a row, right? You take many days to rest in between individual muscle groups. Your anaerobic system, so anaerobic is without oxygen. You want to run really hard for about a minute. Your body really can't get oxygen from the air into your muscles to do that. So we don't burn anything. We just take glucose, we don't burn it, we convert it to what's called lactic acid. And we can do that indefinitely. Unfortunately, the lactic acid will build up in our muscle tissues and shut us down. Anaerobic events last about 30 seconds, kind of like a 400-meter run, right? And then the aerobic system uses oxygen to burn stuff. We are disassembling like you do a fire pit, like you're burning wood or gasoline or diesel. You're disassembling organic molecules, protein, fat, and carbohydrate, and converting them with oxygen into CO2 and H2O. And you can do this really forever. I mean, as long as you get body fat. The problem with aerobic is we usually run out of glucose. And after 2 hours of hiking or running or jogging, we just get really tired. That's why for aerobic athletes, what are they consuming when they're running if you're running a marathon? Not butter, Gatorade, because that's where the glucose is, right? That's our limiting step. That ends this video.